Okay, how's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, well, so in today's episode, I thought I'd try to say something about the famous maxim or injunction, know thyself, because it's pretty important, to say the least. Okay, so the words know thyself were carved into stone at the entrance to the revered temple of Apollo at Delphi in Greece. This temple can be dated as far back as the 8th century BC, but it was especially influential between the 6th and the 4th centuries BC. This injunction, know thyself, is only one of over 100 such sayings or Delphic maxims that were visible in the different parts of the temple. For example, you might also find injunctions like control the eye and shun murder. But know thyself has, I think, far and away become the most famous of them all, a close second being nothing in excess. Anyway, know thyself, it became something like a leitmotif of Greek thought. And you might say a kind of guiding light for the philosophy that was to come. Okay, but what did it mean exactly? Well, I think that most likely in its earliest and most general sense, know thyself was meant as a reminder of our limitations, of our weakness and insignificance as humans compared to the gods. And so to warn us against hubris or overreaching. It was meant to remind us of our mortality and the gulf that existed between us humans and the gods. Knowing thyself, then, meant humility. It meant knowing your limit and staying within it, so to speak. Now, like I said, this was probably not only its earliest meaning, but it's also a meaning that persists throughout in the background of Greek thought and later. Okay, but that said, I think that know thyself actually got interpreted or appropriated in slightly different ways by some later artists and thinkers. And here in particular, I'm thinking about the Greek tragic playwright Sophocles and the philosopher Socrates. So by way of introduction here, let me start with, of all people, the much later French philosopher René Descartes. So Descartes said something really interesting. He said that there is nothing more easily or clearly apprehended than my own mind. In other words, for Descartes, our own mind is completely transparent to us. We're immediately conscious of what's going on in our mind, at least as things present themselves to us in the moment. Okay, now this idea that we're completely transparent to ourselves, that self-knowledge is easy, this is important here. It's important in the sense that I think that something like this is the very opposite of what Sophocles and Socrates took know thyself to mean. For them, we're not marked by self-transparency. No, for them, there are regions of ourselves that are not always readily acknowledgeable or available to us. We have blind spots, and we have dark alleys. We have a real lack of knowledge about many of our motives and beliefs and thoughts and feelings. And so things are not always as they seem. Well, okay, so given this, I think that in their own way, what both Sophocles and Socrates take know thyself to come down to is the project of self-discovery and self-rectification and even self-integration, as difficult and as shocking as that might often be. Okay, well, so now let me get into the specifics a bit. And let me begin with Sophocles, and in particular with his very famous play, Oedipus Rex. So we all know Oedipus, right? You know, where the baby Oedipus, the future king of Thebes, is marked out by the oracle as someone who's going to kill his father and marry his mother. only to find out much later in his life, importantly, after much of his own probing and searching, that this prophecy has actually been fulfilled. That he has, in fact, unbeknownst to him, shared his bed with his mother and slain his father. And by the way, when he finally figures all this out, he cuts his eyes out. Okay, so how is this connected to know thyself? Well, the point is that Oedipus is possessed by the pursuit of trying to figure out who murdered his father. He wants so much to know this. Actually, it's interesting. Part of the etymology of the name Oedipus is the Greek word oida, which means to know. Anyway, this is how Sophocles depicts Oedipus, as someone who's in effect looking to figure out who he is. He's looking for self-knowledge and for some kind of self-transparency. Now, actually, in this way, Oedipus deserves some praise for trying to take an honest look in the mirror. He doesn't want to live in bad faith, to borrow from modern existentialism. However, the problem with this is that it turns out to be a kind of groping in the dark. Oedipus is limited in his insight, and so he remains essentially hidden to himself, not to mention from those who share his own household. So he who solved all problems, including the riddle of the Sphinx, turns out himself to be the one problem beyond all answers. Okay, so what's Sophocles saying then? How is he interpreting know thyself? Well, I think he's saying that we're not as self-transparent or, by the way, as pure as we think we are. And that if we do come to discover something about ourselves, we might not like it. In other words, maybe at the end of the day, self-knowledge is not the sort of knowledge we wanted to find in the first place. So we should be careful what we wish for. Sometimes we won't be aware of the danger or the tragedy until it's already upon us. Maybe the project of knowing thyself, maybe what we discover about ourselves turns out to be our own undoing and our own doom rather than our salvation, as it eventually turned out to be for Oedipus. Oedipus couldn't live without trying to know himself, and then he couldn't bear to live having found out. Okay, well, so that's Sophocles. Now, what about Socrates? How does he interpret or appropriate the Delphic injunction, know thyself? Well, first of all, we know that he's clearly interested in it because, he says it himself. He says this, he says, I am not yet able, as the Delphic inscription has it, to know myself. So it seems to me ridiculous when I do not know that to investigate irrelevant things. In other words, what he's saying in this context is that he has no interest in pursuing knowledge of the stars or of science, and more broadly of the external world, until he has first come to know something about himself. Knowing himself, that's the most important thing. For Socrates, this comes before all else. Okay, but still, what is it exactly for him? Well, I think that what know thyself mostly comes down to is something like humility and a deep examination of one's beliefs and principles. It's when the mind turns around and examines itself. We have to look at ourselves honestly in order to try to see where we have flaws and inconsistencies in our thinking and where we hold unjustified certainties. Now, you might think, well, why? What's the big deal if we do? Well, I think that Socrates might say that if we are out of tune with ourselves, that is, if we hold inconsistent or contradictory views, and if we really don't understand the meanings of the words that we use, then it's not clear who it is we are. or that we have a consistent or stable self, or that we can act properly and successfully in the world. How can we continue to hold a principle or a belief that we can't articulate, or that we know isn't consistent with some other belief that we have? And if we can't do that, then what do we really believe? And so who are we really? You see, for Socrates, our thoughts structure who we are. They're a true manifestation of our soul. This is why turning inward to examine ourselves and our thinking is essential. Because we don't want to live with a foggy and obscured soul. No, we want to try to cleanse ourselves of things like inaccurate language and the misuse and the abuse of words and arrogance and prejudice and errors and faulty thinking. What we want is to live with clarity and integrity. This is, I think, the project of knowing oneself for Socrates. And so ultimately, we can see then that this is a form of personal integration and self-rectification. That is the goal. Its goal is nothing less than the saving of our soul. Bye for now.